So I'm going to do something slightly different in today's auto-contouring review. Rather than reviewing a paper that has developed an auto-contouring method or is evaluating an auto-contouring method, we'll be looking at a paper that evaluates measures to evaluate auto-contouring. And in this paper by Femke Vaassen, Evaluation of Measures for Assessing Time Saving of Automatic Organ and Risk Segmentation in Radiotherapy, a new measure is proposed which seems to correlate better with the time taken to correct contours. Because the interview with Femke is quite long, overran somewhat, I told myself that I'd restrict myself to one single slide. And I thought this figure from the paper is probably the most appropriate to summarise. Then looking into it in more detail, I can't limit myself to a single slide. I thought I'd have to do a few more. And rather than trying to explain it using the figure from the paper, I'd explain what the method is using simple geometric shapes. So we take these two shapes and imagine that they've been auto-contoured by some auto-contouring system. We have the contour on the left, which is roughly the right shape, and the one on the right, which, again, pretty much the right shape, but maybe misses part of the contour on the right-hand side. Both of these contours end up having exactly the same dice score. But they are quite different contours. So are those contours the same quality of segmentation? The dice similarity coefficient would suggest that they are. In this paper, they propose the added path length. The added path length looks at the amount of contour that would have to be drawn to correct the contour. So in the case of the contour on the left, you'd have to draw around the whole boundary. You'd have to correct the contour everywhere. Whereas for the contour on the right, actually a large part of the boundary is already correct. Nothing needs to be done. And the added path length ends up being that section which hadn't been contoured. So if we look at the added path length for these two figures, the one on the left has an added path length of 80 centimetres, while the one on the right has an added path length of 11 centimetres, suggesting the one on the right is going to be easier to use in practice. And this is what Femke found in the paper, and this is really the money shot from the paper. The added path length correlated really well with the time taken to edit contours. And that's what we really want to evaluate in a clinical scenario. It's not whether the contour overlaps well, it's how long is it going to take me, how efficient is it going to be to use this automatic contouring method. Let's now hear what Femke has to say about the paper.
Hi Femke, thanks for joining me today to discuss your paper on the added path length. At first glance, people might think that the added path length and the surface dice measures are essentially the same. But there are some sort of important differences, particularly one that for me is how you handle deleting slices. What do you think the most significant difference between these two measures is?
Yeah, indeed, as you mentioned, there are some differences. I would say that the added path length relates better to absolute editing time, as you can also see in the results. And with the added path length, you actually only take into account adding slices or adding contour regions. And what we assume there is that deleting slices actually does not take any time. Because normally if you would delete the whole slice, you would just press the delete button of that slice, and that would take really less time. So you would just say, okay, that takes no time at all. So only adding slices are taken into account there. And actually with surface dice, you take into account both adding and deleting slices in the same way, because you just look at contour overlap, and there is no distinction between adding or deleting slices there. So I would say that's the most difference there.
And that comes out the surface dice really being a 3D sort of
Yeah,
interpretation of the surface, that the concept of a slice doesn't exist within that.
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And then when you're editing a contour and you're removing part of the contour, are you ignoring that? I mean, is that adding or is that taking away? How does that work?
Well, we assume actually that if a technician removes part of the contour, that's actually done by adding another part of the contour. So, and that's the thing that takes time, because that's the path that you draw. And if you draw a new part, yeah, you actually remove something else, but that's automatically done then.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's adding that new path rather than deleting what was there.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And we discussed quite a bit, actually, while you're working on this paper, the idea of adding a tolerance, which we saw in the surface dice paper. And you looked at thresholds of 0 millimeters and 1 millimeter as sort of tolerances for clinical acceptability. That threshold of 1 millimeter is fairly arbitrarily chosen. How do you think people might use it in practice and choose that threshold?
Yeah, what we actually did with choosing this threshold of 1 millimeter, we used that threshold to compare the automatic contour with a fully manual contour, where we chose this threshold of 0 millimeter if we are comparing the automatic contour with the user-adjusted contour. And there we chose 0 millimeter because actually every adjustment that was made was done. So if you want to relate it to time, you need every adjustment. And if you want to compare to the manual contour, we actually wanted to prevent taking into account also changes between differences between the two contours that were within clinical relevance. And this 1 millimeter, indeed, we chose kind of arbitrarily. And actually what would be better there is to have some knowledge about inter-observer variability, so that you can say better, okay, this is the clinically relevant difference basically for that organ. And here we assumed kind of that 1 millimeter was a good tolerance to take into account for the organs in the thorax region. But actually, we also think that an inter-observer variability study would be best here to perform, to give a better idea about the tolerance there.
Yeah, so for the thorax, you might find that the variation in the lung is very small.
Exactly.
But where there's larger variation, say around the heart, you might want to allow more tolerance.
Yeah, exactly, because that's what we also see in clinical practice, that, for example, for the heart, indeed, technicians draw it a little bit differently sometimes, so that they also don't fully agree to each other what they think is the exact location where the contour should be. And for the lungs, normally it's easy to see. So
this the challenge is that inter-observer variability is perhaps different to what they would edit, because if two technicians have drawn a different contour and one comes to look at the other person's contour, they might still edit it.
Yeah,
really,
true.
Rather than measuring how different people are, you almost need to measure how sensitive they are and to what they might want to edit of somebody else's.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but that's also what we think with the use of auto contouring, right? Is that also that this inter-observer variability would decrease, and that they would maybe agree more with each other.
Yeah, hopefully.
Yeah.
In figure 3, I mean, looking at that figure, it seems to suggest that there's about 1 second of adding path length for every 3 centimeters of added path length, regardless of the organ. Surely that's going to be operator dependent, though. Depends on the speed they're going to contour, and therefore makes it kind of hard to compare in terms of the time. Do you think that conversion factor matters, or is it sufficient just to know the distance, the added path length, and to know that it's going to relate to contouring time in some way?
Well, in the study we only used one technician to do the contouring, so we did not use multiple technicians. But yeah, as we might already know from literature already, is that, for example, from literature from Groningen, that the editing time also depends on the experience level of the technician. So that's something where we should do some kind of calibration, probably, to take into account the editing tools, but also then indeed the observer and the experience level. So what we hypothesize here is that we can use this relation within our center, but if you want to use it in another center, you probably should do some kind of calibration first to be able to use the relation.
So the time itself might not be comparable between centers or experts, but that distance measurement of, I've added 5 centimeters of extra path length should be comparable, because that's what you've done to the contour.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so that's what we assume here, that maybe other technicians in other centers, they take more time or less time, but if you kind of calibrate the curve, you can also use the same amount of distance, basically.
Yeah. So I mean, that's kind of where I've come at this paper from in looking at it, is how we might compare different auto contouring methods or different clinics and in how much they edit, etc. One of the strengths of the DICE similarity coefficient is that it's easy to compare between papers. Firstly, because there's no choice around tolerances, etc., to make. But secondly, and perhaps more importantly, is it's really easy to implement DICE. And actually, if I implement it and you implement it, we're probably going to come up with the same number. Now, whereas with added path length, I mean, I've implemented it, you've implemented it, and we've compared our results, and they were about 30% different. Now, that was because I used a contour-based method and you've done a voxel-based method. But do you think the added path length is robust enough to compare between centers, or do you think, I mean, that was one example difference. Do you think it's going to be a too sensitive measure for routine use?
Well, as you said, indeed, DICE is really user-friendly, basically, and everybody uses it the same way. But as I've also shown in the paper, in one example, it does not really correlate to editing time. So that makes it really difficult to say anything about contour quality in that sense.
Yeah.
And yeah, indeed, we use some kind of discretized implementation of the added path length. And we did that because if we use it like that, you can use it in a bigger patient group because it's faster. So as you mentioned, it indeed depends on the implementation that you use. But I think if you also use there the calibration, you have the same factor of difference. So then that doesn't matter. If you do the calibration, then it should be fine and it should be robust enough to use it.
So I guess, within one center, if you're using the same implementation, you can compare two contouring methods quite easily. Between centers, people have to be aware that there could be a difference, but at the same time, it has more value. So it's worth putting in that effort.
Yeah, exactly. I agree.
That was very much my focus coming to this paper. Your focus was more on how the technician or the dosimetrist can use this knowledge to help their contouring process. Do you want to expand more on that idea?
Yeah, sure. Well, basically how they look at the contours now, you see that actually in the same example as I just mentioned. Normally they would look at the contour and look at volume overlap to kind of judge how good the contour is. But as you see in that example also, if the DICE can be, for example, let's say 95%, but actually the contour is a couple of millimeters off on a really big surface area of the contour. And in that way, the technician would then judge the contour to be quite good, but actually they would need to change very much, approximately the whole contour. So that would take them a lot of time.
Yeah.
And if they would be able to only look at the contour itself and not the volume overlap, then they would be able to judge way better if the contour is good or not. So then, they would need to kind of shift their idea of a good contour from volume to surface or path length. And if they would be able to do that, they would be better able to judge if a contour is good. But another part actually there is also you can discuss whether such a small difference, maybe of only a couple of millimeters, is actually relevant. Because maybe changing the contour of 2 millimeter, maybe that's not even relevant if we look further up in the workflow and look at dose distributions. And that's actually a part where we want to look into now to see if such a small difference in contour difference, basically, so that can be either inter-observer variability, but also from automatic contour to adjusted contour, if that's a relevant difference or not. So maybe they don't even have to change the automatic contour there.
Training them to think about how long something's going to take to edit, whether it's better to start from scratch or edit, but also getting them to understand that tolerance parameter. Say, you know what, if it's within 1 millimeter, you are spending time making a change that's meaningless clinically, and you might as well accept that and look for the big errors.
Yeah, exactly, because that in the end would not change, for example, the mean dose to the heart or something. And so we want to think about a way to make that clear to the technicians, to kind of maybe visualize it in some kind of way, so that we can guide them, like, okay, this region, don't spend too much time here, maybe focus on this particular region of the heart, for example.
Great. Well, I think this paper's a really good contribution. I think it's quite exciting that having a measure that correlates to editing time, and hopefully people will start to adopt it in their work, and maybe finally the DICE similarity coefficient can be put to rest.
Well, thanks.
So what measures should we use for assessing auto-contouring? Well, you can probably guess what my opinion's going to be. I think the added path lengths are a really exciting and valuable contribution because it provides a quantitative measure which correlates to the clinical use of auto-contouring. I certainly am going to be advocating that we should be using this method, and I myself will be using it in any publications that I put out in the area of auto-contouring going forward. The question remains, are measures such as DICE still useful? I think the DICE similarity coefficient has been used historically, at least over the past 10 years, in this field. And there's an expectation that this is a measurement that you would report in a paper. And in that sense, it may be useful for historical comparison. But as we saw in the example at the beginning, you can have two contours which have the same DICE score, whereas one of them would require completely editing, and the other one requires a lot less editing. So I don't think the DICE similarity coefficient reflects the clinical use case we have here. And therefore, actually we should discourage its use. And the need to compare historically possibly isn't worthwhile, given that that comparison has little meaning. Thanks for listening again. If you have a paper that you want to suggest, or you're an author of a paper and you would like to be featured on the auto-contouring review, do reach out to me via the comments